So in physics, there's a principle called your moment of inertia. And it's a way to describe like how spread out the weight in your car is. Okay? Think of a pendulum. A really long pendulum has a big moment, and a really short pendulum has a small moment. Okay? Like one's easier to turn than the other, right? If you were holding the pendulum out and trying to like rotate it around. So the idea of a mid-motor is to bring the weight inboard and to reduce the size of that moment. Specifically, when I say moment, there's actually three of them. You have a front to rear, you have a up to down, and a left to right. Okay, that's how, you know, if you wanted to plug this car into a physics formula, if you wanted to put it in a spreadsheet or into, you know, some kind of, if you wanted to predict how it's going to perform in the corner or how much weight transfer you're going to have, you'd use those moments, you'd figure out those moments, and you'd use that in your equation to determine how the car is going to roll, to determine how much force it's going to transfer, that kind of thing. So the big idea of the mid-motor is to reduce the long axis moment, to bring the car inboard. And by doing that, you make the car inherently faster reacting. It's going to corner quicker, it's going to square up faster, it's going to rotate faster. Like everything about the car just does it faster, okay? Like to think about, you know, your car to go around a corner, and I'm not talking about like going in and like slamming on the brakes and pivoting your car, right? But even just to go around a corner, your car has to make that rotation, right? To go from this direction to that direction. And so the mid-motor allows it to make that corner faster. It's going to inherently carry more speed off sweepers, it's going to rotate faster in 180s, so on and so forth. Another advantage is that it's going to be actually more stable, okay? Like as stuff starts, once a rear motor car starts bouncing in say a washboard section, or if you land a jump wrong and it starts going, you know, your car lands and kind of hops sideways or whatever. Like once that rear motor car starts sliding out, or once that motor starts moving from behind the rear axle, like the car's kind of gone. And sure, I mean, you can counter steer and you can always try to save it, but it's gone. Like it's going to take a lot to bring that back. Whereas the mid-motor car being, again, with that moment being smaller, it's going to be inherently easier to catch. A lot of people describe, like when they watch my car, my two-wheel, they describe it, it looks like a four-wheel, right? Because four-wheels are inherently mid-motor. But like it has that, I can kind of throw it around and like gather it up faster. Now the big downside of a mid-motor is that you lose forward traction, right? The reason the motor was put in the back in the first place, there are two reasons. One, because the very first RC cars were designed off dune buggies, real live dune buggies, and dune buggies were designed off VW Beetles. So if you really want to know where the RC10 came from, it came from a VW Beetle, which is the fastest race car that's ever been made. But second, it worked back in the day when tires were hard as rocks, and I'm talking late 80s, early 90s. If you actually go back, so Losi, not making tires anymore, but they had like red and pink compounds, right? Before red was silver, before silver was gold, and before gold was HT compound. This is like 92. HT stood for high traction, right? This is like, yeah, early 90s. And the thing was a damn Chinese throwing star. Like you could kill somebody with this tire. And so like they were really searching, like their tires didn't dig in, their tracks were blown out, kind of rough, you know, loose, sandy stuff. And they were searching for, just to get the cars to go straight was a problem. So they put that motor in the back and they left it in the back, and they tested mid-motor back in the 80s, but it wasn't fast because they needed that inherent weight. They needed that long pendulum to make the car stable and have rear bite. They needed that motor hanging out back here to push down on the rear axle to give it forward traction. Chaz and I, as we looked at making a two-wheel drive car in 2005, said to ourselves, look, tires have come, we've had 15 years of tire development. We're running these super soft, sticky compounds. Tracks have gone where this track would have been super smooth back in the, hey, my battery's full. Yeah, this track would have been super smooth, high bite back in like 1990, right? But this is low traction and as bumpy as an indoor track gets almost. Whereas, you know, you go to RC Excitement and it's super smooth. You go to Motorama, it's like high traction, you know, we're pulling wheelies. And so Chaz and I said, look, it's time to get rid of that archaic design. It's time to go with the faster, more nimble, easier to drive setup. And that's the advantages that I believe mid-motor has. Now, when we first came out with the car, we did struggle a little bit. And it took me to come up, remember I got a physics degree, right? And the thing about physics versus engineering, engineers have an equation and they use it. Like they look in their books, you know, and it says, all right, F equals mass times acceleration, and they plug in their numbers and they use it. Physicists come at it and they say, all right, why does force equal mass times acceleration? You know, they're kind of like a step back from engineering. And so when I look at the car, and when I looked at our mid-motor car, the very first X6 we made, I kind of looked at it as this combination of physical, like rather than the individual items and rather than the all right, this is a 440 bolt going into 6061 aluminum, it was like, how can we get more rear bite? You know, we've gone to this mid-motor and it provides these corner speed advantages and the stability advantages. How can we get that rear traction out of it? And that's when I came up with the 4-gear transmission. So obviously one of the big differences, if you take your like Loshi 22 and you build it rear motor, mid-motor, you have to add an idler gear, and the motor flips around. The pinion's on the left side instead of the right. The reason for that, it kind of takes a weird visualization, but with the extra idler gear and the motor with the pinion on the left side of the car, the motor is now rotating, as I like to describe it, forwards. Okay, the motor is rotating in the same direction as your wheels, and right, it was famous. Newton said, you know, for every action, for every force, there must be an equal and opposite reaction, an equal and opposite force. You know, for me to push against this table, the table has to actually push against me, and that's what we feel when we push on that table. Well, if you can imagine for a minute, hey, my other battery's done.
Actually, it's a brand new charger.
If you can imagine for a minute, so our motor is spinning forward, right? Like as I hold up my car, the motor's going this way. Well, hold the pinion still for a moment. In order for the motor to express that torque going forwards, our chassis has to support the motor and express a torque going backwards. And that's what we drivers feel as weight transfer. When you get on the power with a 4-gear mid-motor car, it has that extra squat, it has that extra dig in, where the car just wants to, you know, like it bites the track and goes, right? Well, that's because, like I said, that for that motor to accelerate forward, for it to drive the tires, your chassis has to squat backwards. And that key, you can, if we back it up with only a 3-gear transmission with the motor, with the pinion on the right side, it's actually backwards. The motor is trying to transfer weight. You know what I mean? Your motor's spinning this way with a 3-gear transmission, so the chassis, as you get on power, the chassis is trying to unload the rear tires. And that's why like a 3-gear rear motor, or a 3-gear mid-motor car just didn't feel very good. It didn't have that drive. It didn't have that connection, you know? And we figured out that by adding that extra idler gear, by going to the 4-gear transmission, is the easy way to call it, you could reverse that motor direction and get that extra kick from the motor. And remember I mentioned that we've kind of gone through this revolution of brushless motors and LiPo batteries, and we have more torque now than we've ever had before. Well, that just helps mid-motor. Like the more torque I put in my car, the bigger that kick is, the more traction I have. You know, the motor, the dynamics of the motor acting on the chassis is one of the most important kind of setup. If we go to the setup kind of dynamics area, I don't want to get too abstract, but the motor and how it works is one of the most important things in the car, and managing that and allowing it to work for you rather than against you. So I hope I didn't go too far with that. All right.